Secretary of State, as you're aware, both the US President and the Vice President visited Scotland this summer. And I know there has been a little bit of back and forth between the UK Government and the Scottish Government on the issue of the security costs. Which government is responsible for covering the £24 million of policing and security costs that were incurred during those visits?
So the character of the visit is determinative of the funding, and in that sense, the key difference in the visit that took place to Scotland in the summer is that in previous visits it followed a formal UK government request and invitation to the visiting, in this case, President of the United States, that triggered the established funding principles. The most recent visit undertaken by the President was not at the formal invitation of the UK government, albeit we were very happy to welcome him to the beauty of Ayrshire and Aberdeenshire. And in that sense, there was a precedent reflecting the character of, in this case, the fact it was a private visit rather than a visit that was where a formal invitation was extended by the UK government.
So just to clarify, you believe the costs rest with the Scottish Government, given they're responsible for policing in Scotland?
Well, to echo the points that Kirstie made earlier, not only are they responsible for policing in Scotland, but they're in a position where the UK government has provided very significant additional resources, £5.2 billion in the latest settlement, and it emerged last week that they have underspent their budget by £1 billion. So I think we're perfectly entitled to ask where that money has gone, and we should at least have that in mind when, as is their wont, they repeatedly ask the UK government for extra resources. I think the important question that many people in Scotland will be asking is, frankly, where's the money gone, John? Is the money being spent effectively? Why are we not in a position where the government is spending the money that it is given in circumstances where I think most of us in our constituencies would agree there is an aching need for additional resources in our health service, in our schools, in our social care system, and in a whole range of other public services, including the police?
Thank you. So following on from that, the White House itself described President Trump's visit as both a private and a working visit, which would suggest he was there in some kind of official capacity. What does this mean for determining which government is responsible, or do you stand with the fact that, given it wasn't at the invitation of the UK government, it's therefore within the devolved competency and responsibilities of the Scottish Government?
Yes, I have many responsibilities as the Secretary of State for Scotland, but speaking on behalf of the White House is not one of them. They're entitled to their own characterisation of the President's visit, and it's perfectly reasonable that they do so. As I say, the basis on which the response was offered by the UK Government was the fact that unusually for a visit from the President, although he was very welcome, this was not on the basis of a formal invitation extended by the UK Government.
Thank you.
Ms McAllister.
Moving on to the subject of city-region deals, you'll be aware that in recent years there has been growing recognition of the importance of regional collaboration and the funding to support the delivery of regional initiatives. What assessment has the UK Government made of the progress and delivery of city-region deals in Scotland, and what does the monitoring process look like for those deals?
The deals are in flight at the moment, so I think I'll defer to Kirstie in terms of some of the work she's been doing over the last year on this.
Yes, so we are now thrilled that every bit of Scotland is now covered by a deal. They are all in flight, different stages of maturity and therefore different stages of their evaluation of impact. But we are absolutely keen with our partners in the Scottish Government and the relevant local authorities to make sure there's as much transparency back to the taxpayer as possible for what's being achieved with those deals. So there is annual reporting, that's all a matter of public record. But actually the key thing for us is we have both universal coverage of UK government investment through the Deals programme, but also the Pride and Police programme that's just been announced means we'll have some more targeted investment too, and we think that's the right balance between making sure that every single Scot is a beneficiary of the Deals programme, but there's another programme with slightly different objectives that's been announced recently too.
Thank you, Chair. We've been remiss in not mentioning at the start I was a signatory to the original Edinburgh South East Scotland City Region deal. As you mentioned, Under Secretary, several deals are nearing completion, including, I think, for Aberdeen and Inverness. I was just wondering if you could explain what guidance the government has issued regarding the closing of the deals, particularly with respect of reporting the impact and the lessons learned, and where we've really seen the value of these deals in local communities.
So there's ongoing evaluation of all the deals that are in flight, including those that are coming towards completion. There's also, and I think you have all been invited to some of these, the Scotland Office has been having some sessions for parliamentarians to make sure that their perspective on the deals is heard too. As I say, there's kind of a number of other government programmes that we are focusing either on adjacent or overlapping objectives. So we've got the Pride in Place programme, as I mentioned, and also there'll be further announcements about local growth funding in due course.
And Chair, with your permission, given Kirsteen's mention of the Edinburgh and South East Scotland deal, I should probably, to keep myself safe, I was a member of the court of the University of Edinburgh in the years immediately preceding my election, and Edinburgh was also a beneficiary of that deal, so I should probably put that on the record.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Yes, I think Edinburgh has benefited quite significantly from that deal, but that's a conversation or a debate for another day.
Yes.
So the question that I'm being asked quite a lot is what comes next. And I think a lot of partners in city region deals are looking for information and detail around what the next steps will be, if there will be another round of funding, particularly those that are about to complete. What update can you give on this, or do you have a timescale where further information can be provided?
So there'll be information about the local growth fund in due course, and I'd say the Pride in Place programme is very much a continuation of that spirit of place-based intervention that we've been, as the happy beneficiary of so many of the impacts of the deal programme so far.
But will there be specific information regarding the city region deals and whether more funding will become available?
As I say, the funding that's available is in these kind of two broad areas. So there's Pride in Place, which is, I would characterise as focused on community regeneration and targeted, and there will be local growth funding, the modalities of which are going to be laid out in the coming months.
So it's likely that the city region deal will form part of that. Is that what you mean?
Honestly, I'd say
it's determined as yet.
I would more focus on the kind of the objectives than the nomenclature. Really, that there'll be local growth funding available that's targeted on place-based growth, and there's Pride in Place that's targeted on place-based regeneration. So I say the nomenclature is sort of neither here nor there from my perspective. What's important is the UK government's committed to both those policy objectives, which is place-based growth that people can feel, and place-based regeneration so that people can have pride in their neighbourhoods.
And in terms of the focus of the department in the last few weeks since I arrived, and Kirsty's been doing great work on this, get Pride in Place up and running, because that's a significant additional contribution from the UK government to make sure that there's place-based support available. Secondly, continue with other government departments to work to support the city deals that are in flight at the moment, and obviously, as this committee has reflected, make sure that we have effective evaluation as to the impact of those city deals. But if you like, there's a dynamic and a correlation between having that effective assessment as to impact and judgments in terms of the future.
If I may very quickly, given you have mentioned Pride in Place, and I'm very glad to hear that a large part of my constituency, West Lothian, will be a recipient of that funding. Can you just tell me how you believe that aligns with the objectives that the City Region deal has looked to deliver?
So, as I say, I would characterise Pride in Place as really about regeneration, which obviously has a relationship to growth but sits slightly adjacent to it. So the formula that's been used for the determination of the local authority areas, which is so far the only announcement that's been made, the formula takes into account both deprivation and access to community infrastructure. So it's a two-part formula about which places are so-called doubly deprived. But as they think of Pride in Place as primarily about regenerating the places where people live so that they can take, the clues in the name, so that they can take pride in them. And I say growth funding will be targeted with slightly different objectives, but of course they are mutually reinforcing.
To deliver the same objectives in local communities?
Well, to have kind of
local growth is central to both.
Places that people want to live and work.
Thank aware that 1 in 6 young Scots are not currently in education, training or employment. So that's 1 in 6 young people that are losing out on vital opportunities to fulfil their potential and to thrive. Are the UK and Scottish governments aligned in their approach to addressing youth unemployment in Scotland?
Well, you're absolutely right. It is a shocking indictment of the last 20 years in Scotland that we've got 1 in 6 of our young people finding themselves in that position. And we are certainly not aligned in our thinking in relation to FE colleges, because we fundamentally think Scotland deserves better than a 20% cut in FE colleges in a context in which 1 in 6 of our young people don't have positive destinations. So in that sense, it's worth recognising that there is a divergence there. But in relation to how can our governments work together effectively, of course, we want to play our part in relation to addressing those issues, and Kirsty can say a word or two in terms of the skills and the training work that is led by the Scottish Government, but how we're thinking about that in relation to the UK Government.
Yeah, I think it's worth reflecting, and I think the Secretary of State mentioned this earlier. Almost every conversation we have with any stakeholder in Scotland ends up being a conversation about skills and access to work. Like it's such a fundamental problem for all of our businesses and organisations. It's worth just reflecting on what is happening in England with mayoral strategic authorities, where the youth guarantee trailblazers are currently being evaluated, and we'll make sure that there's any lessons learned from that. But it's worth reflecting in the context that, as we have often said, kind of the Scottish Government has been very, very interested in prosecuting an argument about devolution to Scotland, but not inside Scotland. So our capacity to do more interesting strategic level work regionally in Scotland is diminished, but where we do have those levers available in England, we're making sure that the trailblazers are being evaluated properly, and any lessons will be learned for the design of anything that operates UK-wide.
Thank you. You did just answer my second question. However, I do want to just touch upon that last point that you made, to recognise that skills are devolved in Scotland. However, the DWP does still retain levers for unemployment, and I wonder, given the gravity of the situation and the opportunities potentially lost to those 1 in 6 young Scots, is there anything more that the DWP could actively be doing in Scotland to support these young people and support them into and giving them access to the life chances that we should all have?
I would say yes to that. I was in the Cabinet yesterday, and without breaching Cabinet confidentiality, Pat, who's a very good friend and a former colleague of mine in Edinburgh University Labour Club and knows Scotland back to front, was talking about the challenge that we face in relation to youth unemployment. And there are parallel challenges. One is the number of young people who are out of work on unemployment benefits. There's also a significant challenge in relation to young people who are on sickness benefits. And if you like, those benefits are often sticky, and once someone gets onto benefits at a relatively young age, it is a bigger challenge as the years pass for them to come off that benefits and get back into the workforce. So in terms of the work that we're doing at a UK-wide level, in terms of how do we reform Job Centre Plus, of course there's relevance to Scotland, and we stand ready as Scotland Office Ministers to work and engage with Pat and with others to make sure that we are both learning the right lessons from pilots that have been developed down here, and also applying those lessons where appropriate as the UK Government in Scotland.
Thank you. I do believe that young people in Scotland should have access to the same opportunities that people do in the rest of the UK. So thank you for that. How do you respond to the Resolution Foundation's concerns about the UK Government's plan to abolish youth rates within the minimum wage, and that it may cause young people to be priced out of entry to the labour market?
I should probably declare I'm a very good friend of Torsten Bell, the former director of the Resolution Foundation, who's now doing important work for us in the Treasury and the Department of Work and Pensions that we've just been discussing. And it's right to recognise the Resolution Foundation has done important work in relation not just to youth unemployment, but also to poverty and inequality over a number of years. We are committed to abolishing or removing the age bands for adults, and to create a single adult minimum wage rate. And we recognise that the 18 to 20 band does bring particular challenges in relation to what are often starter jobs for people at that age. Angus was mentioning previously hospitality. And tourism, one of the great strengths of hospitality and tourism is it is often, along with retail, the sector of the economy where most people get their first job. And in that sense, we need to be sensitive to that and consider all of that carefully. In the remit that was published in August of this year, we asked the Low Pay Commission as a government to take into account the effects of employment on younger workers, incentives for them to remain in training or education and the wider economy. So it's with the Low Pay Commission at the moment.
Thank you. Chair, it's just to come back to this issue of youth unemployment. Now, we're hearing from the workforce, and this committee has heard in many evidence sessions about the skills shortage that industry is facing. And often it is hampering growth because it can't attract the people that they need to fulfil the positions to push on. At the same time, you've already mentioned the challenges about young people being on sickness benefits. I'm sure everyone around this table has had casework from families who are desperate to get their young people the mental health support that they need. And CAMS waiting lists are often going into years. Some health boards, understand, have actually closed their list to referrals. We have neurodiversity lists opening up under CAMS. Again, people aren't able to get the diagnosis. And a lot of parents are feeling that these are during the most formative years for their young people, which again is going to impact their ability to go out into the workforce with the skills ready, job ready. What more do you think needs to be done in Scotland to tackle these issues in a holistic, joined up way? Because at the moment our young people are losing out on many fronts.
This isn't really something that's the responsibility of the Secretary of State. I'll allow you to answer that.
Directly related to employment opportunities.
So let me try and keep it both in terms of our responsibility, but also to recognise the severity and seriousness of what you describe. Again, without breaching cabinet confidentiality, we were discussing yesterday the youth strategy, which is predominantly focused on England, given a lot of the areas of youth policy are devolved in Scotland. But Lisa Nandy's work painted a very bleak picture in terms of the challenges that our youngest generation are facing today, both as a consequence of COVID, as a consequence of a sense of social isolation, and a whole series of challenges that have been exacerbated and deepened by austerity, where, for example, if you look at the presence of youth workers or youth clubs compared with when I was young, in many communities across the whole of the UK, they've simply vanished. And it was in that context that Pat was talking about the importance of our offer in relation to work for young people who are being failed by a system that are passported straight onto benefits, often in the context of mental health challenges, and then get stuck in the system. And the point that he was making, which I think is a powerful and important one, was not only, as is often covered in the newspapers, is there a cost to the exchequer there, but at least as significantly, if not way more significantly, that's not good for the young people themselves. And in that sense, collectively, we need to do better. And that means I think it is right and reasonable for us to challenge the Scottish Government to say, why are we seeing a 20% cut in FE colleges? But it's also important that we, in terms of Job Centre Plus, say, how do we make sure Job Centre Plus and job centres across our communities can actually be a resource that assists and bridges young people coming into the workplace. And again, I spoke at the beginning of the committee, Chair, about my longevity. I was part of a government that implemented the New Deal for the Young Unemployed. And we basically at that point said there should be 4 options but no 5th option. You can't lie in bed not accepting choices. And there was overwhelming public support for that, because any of us as parents or as grandparents or as aunts and uncles think, what would we want for our own family member? We would not want them stuck with no real access to mental health services, because consistently across Scotland the waiting times and waiting lists for CAMS in particular is deeply troubling to the families, and we'll all have constituents like that at the moment, and without access to the kind of support that will actually support and assist those kids. So I think, A, you shouldn't just think in terms of parity of esteem on mental health, but access to services. We would not say to a stage 1 cancer patient, come back to us when you're stage 4. And in that sense, we have to do better in relation to mental health. But at the same time, that means there's a responsibility on the UK government in terms of DWP, but there's critically a responsibility in relation to the Scottish Government, where 1 in 6 of us are on waiting lists. We don't have adequate provision in relation to mental health, and we're also seeing a 20% cut in relation to the FE College budget.